You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 500 years of Lutheranism.
A mighty fortress it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Knight Jake Zabel. It's been a while since I've last recorded an episode, but for the past month I have started doing vicarage for the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church. I'm no longer a member of the Lutheran Church of Australia, but I'm a member of the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, or the AELC. There's reasons for that, and if anybody would like to know why, they can email me at amightyfortresspodcast@yahoo.com.au, and I would be able to fill you in on why I have left the LCA and joined the AELC. The AELC is a small confessional Lutheran synod based entirely in Queensland, mainly in the southeast Queensland. We're a very small synod, but we're also a very solid conservative confessional Lutheran synod. We're also in fellowship with the United Lutheran Mission Association, or known as the ULMA or ULMA, which is another small confessional Lutheran synod over in America. Now, on my website, the Order of Knight George, which for the time being is still www.clam.info, that's www.clam.info. If you go to that website, you can find the Articles tab, and if you go there, you will find my name. I think I'm under Vicar Jake Zabel. And if you open up the tab, you'll notice that I've written a few articles. There's my article there called The Purpose-Driven Life, which is my book review on Rick Warren's The Purpose-Driven Life. There's also my treatise there on suicide, which I wrote. I wrote that as a theological paper after I'd lost my own father to suicide, and that I also struggled with suicidal depression. So I eventually went around and wrote a theological paper on the issue of suicide and on the salvation of a person who does die from suicide. On that page I also have a paper on Pastor Schurmeister, who was the founding pastor of the Lutheran Synods in Queensland. He was probably a bit of a centralist. He didn't like to see himself as either a liberal or a conservative. He tried to hold middle ground and bring both sides together. There's also my paper up there on the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australasia. Now, they were a small breakaway synod that formed in 1912, and while some of their congregations were able to last a bit longer, the synod collapsed in 1914 due to the fact that they were all German pastors and they all had connections with Germany, and so they were suspected of being spies. And so the pastors were arrested, and some of their congregations faced a lot of persecution and difficulty during the World War I period. They were more of a liberal synod. They were a small little breakaway one that the reason they formed was because they wanted to have fellowship with the Prussian Union, whereas the rest of the Australian Lutherans didn't. My main interest in doing a paper on them was, one, my great-grandfather was the treasurer for the synod, and also I wanted to have a look because this was a small breakaway synod here in Queensland and there's not a lot of history written on them. In the three main history books we have on Lutheranism in Australia, that's the history book that's Brouwer's history book on the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia, Haybart's book on the United Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, and Tierley's 100 Years of Lutheranism in Queensland. Those three books only briefly mention the Australasian Synod. Any other Lutheran history book doesn't mention them at all, and I was able to find some history of them in old copies of like the Brisbane Courier and the Toowoomba Courier and other local Queensland papers from the 1910s period. So I've done quite an extensive research onto them. I found pretty much everything that can be said on that synod. There's actually not a whole lot. That's why my paper is called The Forgotten Synod, because they have been forgotten. Not many people even know they even existed, mainly because they only really lasted for 3 years. And they only had like 5-6 congregations, so they weren't very big and they didn't go for very long. You can find all those articles on the Order of Knight George website under the Articles tab in the tab that says Jake. Now, in addition to all those articles, I have recently written another paper. Well, recently finished it and published it. And self-publishing, I mean, by putting it up on my website. But I've written this quite a while ago. I've just now edited it, finished it, and made it available to the public. And it's my article on cloning. It's called Cloning What If? The whole purpose of this paper is to answer the question of going, now, I'm against cloning, but despite what I think, there are people who are for cloning, there are scientists who keep pushing for it and keep trying to do it, and eventually we might end up in a world where there are clones walking around. That we may one day be in a future where my neighbour is a clone, or my best friend is a clone, or one of the people at church is a clone. And so as a Christian and as a future pastor, I have questions about how do I handle clone parishioners? How do I go about dealing with a parishioner who is a clone? I mean, it's a very different circumstance. And so I decided to write an ethical paper on how do we respond to cloned people in the church and in society. So I'm not looking at the actual issue of should or shouldn't we clone. I mean, I don't think we should clone, and I might touch on that a bit during this podcast now or over this series of podcasts. But I'm mainly dealing with how do we respond to people who are already clones. So if clones do exist and they start walking among us, how do we react to that? How do we respond as a church and as a society? And so I've written this paper, and you'll be able to find it on my website, the Order of Knight George, under the Articles tab at Jake Zabel. And what I've decided to do is I've also decided to take this paper and do a podcast on it. So I'm going to be reading from the paper, but I'm also going to be giving an expansion and explanation on the paper, so that this podcast will kind of act as a commentary to the paper. Now, I've decided to break this paper up into 7 parts, and so I'm going to be doing 7 episodes of this. So the next 7 episodes of A Mighty Fortress will be dedicated to the topic of cloning and to this cloning paper. The first week I'm going to be doing now is the introduction. The second week I'm going to be going through the personhood of a clone. The next one I'll be going through original sin, the image of God, the soul, and then the last 2 weeks I'm going to be wrapping up with what does cloning mean for implications theologically and eschatologically. So theologically and in the church, what are the implications of cloning? And then the week after that I'll be looking at the socio-political impacts of cloning. So what implications do we have politically and socially in regards to cloning? That may also cover things in there like economics and things like that as well. So it's not just social, political. But this is going to be what I am planning to do over the next 7 weeks. There'll be 7 episodes of this on cloning. I hope you enjoy the topic. I hope you're interested. There's quite a lot of interesting things here, not just on clones, but I have to go into whole big parts on the image of God and the soul and original sin. So there'll be other interesting topics coming up as well. So not just cloning, there'll be heaps of theological information on original sin, soul, the image of God. And so I really hope that you do enjoy this topic. And if you have any questions surrounding either cloning or anything else said in these episodes, whether it be on the image of God, the soul, original sin, or something else, you can email the show by emailing us at amightyfortresspodcast@yahoo.com.au. If you email the show, and you can email the show and you can send in any questions or discussion points you have on this topic of cloning or anything else I've said, I would encourage listeners to participate while I'm doing this cloning series. send in any questions you have and I'll respond to them on the next episode. So let's get underway. Cloning, also known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, is the process of asexual reproduction that bypasses the normal process of conception to produce a person with the exact DNA, genome, and genetic structure of the somatic donor. So what this means is that, so what happens in the process of cloning is the scientist will take a woman's egg and they will destroy the nucleus in it, just wipe it, so thus destroy the DNA. No, this is not destroying a baby because at this point it is just an egg, so it's not yet a human child. They will wipe it, pretty much just taking out the DNA from the egg. Then they'll take what's known as a somatic cell. So somatic comes from the Greek word soma, which means body. And so somatic cell is just the term for any cell that pretty much isn't a sexual cell. So whether that be skin cell, blood cell, or anything else. They'll take the nucleus out of the somatic cell and transfer it into the egg. Therefore, this egg now has the exact same DNA as whoever wants to donate. I mean, you don't even need to do this process because you could do it without the transfer. I mean, the egg that we have from the woman is an exact DNA copy of the woman that you've got the egg from. Now what they do then is they take this egg and they put it under a whole mixture of chemicals, electricity. Depending on the scientist, there's always different processes of how they do this. But what they do is they manipulate the egg to function like a zygote. So a zygote is the term when you have a fertilized egg, so an embryo, when sperm and egg come together to form actual baby. I'm a pro-life, and so I do believe that life starts at conception. I mean, scientifically, you can also notice this, that when you mix the sperm and egg together, it starts to become a self-replicating life form with its own unique DNA. If that's not a human life, then I don't really know how you define life, because that's what life is. Life is a distinct organism with its own DNA that is able to self-replicate and produce its own cells and grow and function. And that's what an embryo is. So I do believe that life starts at conception, and that fertilized embryo that is now self-replicating is known as a zygote. So what the scientists have done is they've taken an egg or an oocyte and they've manipulated it to function like a zygote. So this is just a plain egg, but they've manipulated it so that it now starts to become a self-replicating organism. And in doing that, it happens without sperm. So now that this egg has never received any male DNA, it's only taken the DNA that's from the egg, the DNA provided by the woman. So if you take an egg from a woman and you do this, then that egg would have the same DNA as the woman that you've taken the egg from. If you do the somatic cell nucleus transfer, which is what they do in cloning, and you wipe the DNA of the egg and then take the DNA from another cell and stick in there, then you will get an exact genetic replica of the person that you've taken the DNA from, whether they be male or female. So this is how we get male clones, because you take the somatic cell from a male and you stick it in the female egg, and then you cause the egg to self-replicate. This is a very weird and messy procedure, and it's very dangerous, and not all of these formed zygotes actually live. With Dolly the sheep, it was somewhere up in nearly 270 attempts before they actually got one sheep to form. So that's 270 zygotes that died. That's 270 embryos that died. That's 270 unborn babies that died. So that's one of the reasons why I don't like cloning. It's the same reason why I'm against IVF, is pretty much just the low percentage of actually producing one child. with IVF, now I'm not 100% sure on the exact percentages here, but when it comes to IVF, there's something like they will fertilize 5 eggs to implant in the woman with like a 20 to 30% chance that 1 egg will take. So in other words, in order to get a 20% chance for 1 egg to take, 4 other babies have to die. And some people have to go through multiple attempts at IVF before they can even produce a child. Not thinking about the fact that every time you attempt IVF, multiple fertilized embryos are being inserted into the woman. Those fertilized embryos are a living baby. And every one of those embryos that dies is a baby that is dying. So this is my problem with IVF, because I am pro-life and I believe that every one of those embryos that is made for the purposes of IVF that doesn't grow into a full baby dies. Therefore, that is a dead child, and therefore there is multiple children that are dying just so this family can have 1 child. And it's the same thing with cloning. The percentages are so low, and just to produce 1 clone, we are going to kill hundreds of attempted clones. That's hundreds of babies that will be created and then destroyed just to produce 1 clone. And that's generally the main reason why I'm against cloning. There's a whole bunch of other ethical reasons involved, but that's my chief reason. Now, moving on, there are 2 different categories of cloning. There's reproductive cloning, that is where the embryo is implanted into a uterus and it is allowed to go full term, and hopefully if it survives, it will produce a cloned offspring. This cloned offspring will come out as a baby. So as I said, the clone is an exact DNA, genetic, and genome replica of the donor, but that is not an adult. It will come out as a baby. So if a 40-year-old person donates a cell, you're going to produce a baby that is 40 years behind the donor. Also, because you've taken the cells from a 40-year-old, you're putting aged cells into a baby. When you produce the baby, you're producing it with cells that are like 40 years older than itself. Therefore, that's why clones tend to decay quicker and die earlier. Also, since we're creating them from unnatural processes, that does also have effects on the body, and this is why the cloned animals that we have produced normally come out with a lot of genetic problems. The other type of cloning is called therapeutic cloning, in which the embryo is never implanted but is instead studied or experimented on or harvested for stem cells, as for stem cell research. So this is where they don't actually let the embryo be implanted. Instead, they will experiment on it or harvest its stem cells. Now again, as a pro-lifer, this is horrible because that embryo is a living baby. Therefore, if you start studying it or experiment on it or harvesting its stem cells, thus killing it, you are studying on, experimenting on, and killing a baby, a human baby. And that's, again, that's why I'm against things like stem cell research, because you're experimenting on embryos. These are babies. There are currently 31 countries, including Australia, France, Germany, and Russia, who have outlaws both reproductive and therapeutic cloning, and an additional 15, including Japan, the UK, and Israel, which allow therapeutic cloning but have outlawed reproductive cloning. However, out of these 46 countries, only 7 of them, including Italy, Switzerland, and Ireland, have outlawed stem cell research. Australia has not. So while Australia bans therapeutic cloning and reproductive cloning, we still have stem cell research here in Australia. Now, while many individual states in the US have outlawed cloning, there's no federal prohibition, and therefore it's up to each state. So some states have outlawed it, some states haven't. And in addition, there's no international prohibitions or regulations. So the UN or anyone like that have not made any kind of global law regarding cloning. So there are countries out there where both therapeutic and reproductive cloning is still studied and is free to go ahead. So, like I said, I'm against cloning, I'm opposed to it. This is the view held by the Roman Catholics and the United Methodist Church in America. Plus probably a bunch of other churches out there are also against cloning. I personally also think it would be important for churches to write statements on cloning. So those Lutheran churches out there, if you are against cloning, or even if you're for cloning, put together a statement of faith or something on the issue of cloning now. My main reason is, one, there are studies and experiments happening around the world, and I think it would be important for us to make clear statements on whether we're for that or against that. But also, if cloning becomes an issue in the future, I think that we need to, as a church, have some statements put down in advance so that if clones become more common in the future, we are already prepared to respond to that. So I'm meaning like how you're going to treat clones, whether you're going to baptize clones, whether you allow clones to commune, whether you allow clones to get married, whether you're going to allow clones to even attend your church. You need to put these things down in writing, and you need to make a solid stance now for the future. Because if you don't do it now, you're going to have to do it in the future if cloning happens. Now, I don't know whether or not we will get clones in the future, or whether we will ever be in a position where cloning will be so common that like 1 in 10 people walking down the street will be a clone. I don't know if we'll ever be in a future like that, but the more and more I listen to the different studies and things going on in America and around the world, I don't know, I fear that we're getting closer and closer to a world where, like I said, 1 in 10 people will be a clone, and you'll be walking down the street and you'll be like, oh, he's a normal person, he's a normal person, he's a normal person, he's a clone, she's a clone, that's a normal person, clone, person, clone, etc. But going back to the paper, despite my opposition to cloning, there's no international law against it. Even America doesn't have a federal law against it. And even where there are laws against cloning, legislation is subject to change. So within the future, the laws around cloning may change, and cloning may become a more common practice, and human reproductive cloning may become a regular practice. And so, if such an occasion were to arise, then we could most likely be faced with a situation where clones become an integrated part of society. Clones could be walking down the street, working alongside us, living next door, and yes, attending our churches. And what are we to do if that was to happen? See, at the moment, churches are focused on answering questions in regards to the process of cloning. And those churches that are opposed to cloning have focused their attention on preventing cloning from happening. However, as I said, with this paper, I'm less concerned with prevention and more concerned with reaction. My paper is not aimed at determining whether or not cloning should or shouldn't happen. Instead, my goal is to look at how the church should react if human reproductive cloning became a common occurrence. So yes, I am opposed to all forms of cloning, but for the purpose of this paper, I'm less worried about preventing it and more worried about how I, as a future pastor, would react to this if one of my congregational members turned out to be a clone. And so in this paper, I'm going to address some theological and ecclesiastical issues on human cloning, such as what do we do if a clone wishes to join our congregation? Do we baptize clones? Do clones go to heaven? Will clones be made in God's image and likeness? Will they have souls? Will God hold them responsible for their sins? Will they have original sin? Do they have the capacity to worship God? Will they be sinners by nature, such as original sin, or only by choice? I also have some social-political questions I want to answer, like, will cloning destroy the natural family? Will cloning destroy the traditional family? Will clones provide us with a new soldier-slave class? Will clones have the same rights and responsibilities of a natural-born human? Should clones be treated like subhuman species, a homo replica, or should they be treated like the rest of us? Is it okay to experiment on clones? And also, one that is both theological and political, should clones be allowed to get married? When I actually get to episodes 6 and 7, where I go through the implications on cloning, I'm going to talk about clonal marriage, on whether clones should be allowed to marry, because I think it's not a very straightforward answer, and there are a lot of theological and political and genetic things that need to be considered before we actually say yes or no on clonal marriage. And so, before I can answer any of these questions, I need to answer 4 basic foundational questions. 1. Do clones possess their own individual personhood? 2. Do clones possess original sin? 3. Do clones possess the image of God? And 4. Do clones possess their own individual soul? Over the next few weeks, I'm going to be going through my paper and I'm going to be answering each of these 4 foundational questions, which I will then use to answer those previous questions on the implications of cloning in the church and in society. So I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to the topic of cloning and my paper, Cloning, What If? And I hope you will join us for the next 6 episodes as we go through and we tackle this question of human cloning and how the church and society should respond to it. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Mighty Fortress. I've been your host, Vicar Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.